Hello and welcome to our next book. I'm so excited about this. I've been actually really busting to start on this one, Royal Service by Stephen Barry. Now, a lot of you would have seen our last book series, which was actually Royal Secrets by Stephen Barry. This was actually his first book. Now, when I read it, I feel like he's a little more cautious, just a little more cautious, but it's still got that lovely affectionate feeling, that funny, affectionate, warm feeling. He clearly loved the royal family. He clearly loved the then Prince Charles, and he really loved the Queen. And so he tells all these funny little stories that just warm your heart, and also some ones you don't expect as well. So let's get stuck into it. Royal Service, Chapter 1, and it's titled The Wedding. When I went into Prince Charles's bedroom to wake him on the morning of July 29, 1981, now what happened on that day? Do you know? I bet you do. I found there was no need. For the first time I could remember in 12 years of calling Prince Charles, he was lying there already awake. Now, he's, of course, describing the morning of his wedding to Lady Diana Spencer. So it was a big morning. There was a lot of sort of vibe going on outside the palace in the Mall, and, of course, a lot of vibe going on inside the palace. Lots of excitement amongst the staff. The prince was excited, yet he wasn't nervous at all. And then he goes on to say that the slightest motion or curtain twitch sent everyone outside the palace into a frenzy if they thought someone was going to appear at the window. This almighty roaring cheer would go up and everyone would be just waiting in anticipation for who was going to turn up at the window. But in his rooms, the atmosphere was one of complete calm. He could not have been more relaxed. So he got him dressed by 10:20 into his naval uniform, and he was all ready for his carriage ride to St. Paul's and his bride. And this is what he said. He turned from the mirror and said, "It's been a long time, but at last. Thank you for all you've done, Stephen." "Thank you, sir," I said. It was nearly time to leave. "Is everything ready for Broadlands?" he wanted to know. The newlyweds were to spend the first 2 days of their honeymoon in the home of Lord Mountbatten, who'd been Charles's godfather and almost like a grandfather to him. Now, the next bit makes me really grateful that we're a fly on the wall, because he describes Prince Charles actually going down the stairs, and there was the Queen and Prince Philip and Prince Andrew waiting for their ride to St. Paul's. And he said that all the staff who were not going to the cathedral filled the entrance, waiting to wave everyone off. They clapped when the prince came down the stairs, then cheered as his carriage drove away. All of them are really invested, because they work there and they feel a part of it. So it's really quite wonderful. You can imagine the excitement. Now, Stephen Barry had to race ahead so he could take his seat in the cathedral. He didn't have to help the prince get out of his carriage or anything, not like the bride. I took my seat in the cathedral before the prince arrived. Lady Diana, of course, had her hairdresser and makeup girl waiting, but the royal men do not. And this is interesting. It is sometimes believed that the royal men, wear makeup on state occasions. In fact, they don't need to, as they all have perfect skins. He then goes on to say this, a funny little story about Princess Anne's wedding. "I can remember how amazed Prince Charles was by the way Princess Anne looked at her wedding. She's far too made up," he said when he saw her. I guess, I think maybe I wore more makeup on my wedding day than normal. Let me know down below if you wore more makeup on your wedding day. I think it's because we want to look good in the photographs, don't we? We want to look good, and we want to look good all day into the night. St. Paul's was bathed in light, magnificent flowers abounded everywhere, and gorgeous music soared to the roof of the cathedral dome. The ride back to the palace, so he just skips over the service. He doesn't tell us anything about the service. Wonder whether he fell asleep. The ride back to the palace in the procession after the service with the rest of the guests was an unbelievable experience. From the car where I sat with the prince's household, I could see a sea of faces, smiling, happy faces. And he was saying that even he got cheered on the way back to Buckingham Palace. because the crowd would just pretty much cheer anybody. Anybody that was in the official procession, they got cheered. So he goes on to say about the wedding breakfast, of course, it happened, but he doesn't give us any juicy detail. He doesn't give us anything, which is a little bit frustrating. But he does then say that the prince and his new princess came upstairs to change before they set off in the royal coach for Waterloo and the start of their honeymoon. Briefly, they each went their own ways. She to change in her own little suite with her mother to help her, while I was waiting to assist the prince in his own bachelor rooms. And he said, this is the then Prince Charles saying, "I'm so pleased it went so well," he said. "Did you think it went well?" "What a question," says Stephen Barry. "Outside, the people were still calling for him and the princess." He then went to his study to pack up the papers he wanted to take with him. Even on honeymoon, the royal work would not cease. He peeped through the curtains. "There's a man out there who's painted his head like a Union Jack," he exclaimed. So then he invited Stephen Barry to actually come to the station to say goodbye, because Stephen Barry that wasn't in the plan, but he said, "Are you going to come and say goodbye at the station?" So Stephen Barry got a ride with somebody. He got a ride with Sir John Miller, the Crown Equerry. The atmosphere at Waterloo was very informal. The princess impulsively kissed several people, and just before they got on the train, the prince said, "Thanks for everything, Stephen. I'll see you Saturday at the airport." "I'll be there, sir," I said. So the prince had graciously asked his old team to accompany him on his honeymoon. That included John McLean, his policeman, his equerry, John Winter, me, and the princess's maid and newly acquired policeman, Graham Smith. Doesn't sound like a very romantic honeymoon, does it? I wouldn't want all those people. "There's something for you in the kitchen," said one of the footmen when Stephen Barry got back to the palace. There was a small bottle of champagne. It was from the prince. Okay, so that was just a short little chapter, wasn't it? So we'll do chapter 2 because that's nowhere near long enough, is it? Nowhere near long enough. This is titled The Job by Royal Appointment, and this is where Stephen Barry goes back in time a little bit and tells us how he actually arrived at the palace. The Prince of Wales was in his sitting room at Windsor Castle, a room right above the Queen's in the Queen's Tower. It was July 1970. James MacDonald, the late King George's valet, was with me. "This is Stephen Barry, Your Royal Highness," James said. I bowed, and the prince looked at me with his bright blue eyes. "You're going to have a go at being my valet, are you?" "I'd like to, sir," I replied. Now, bear in mind, he did know him. He did know Stephen Barry because Stephen Barry had been a nursery footman with his favourite nanny. So then Prince Charles, whenever he went up to the nursery to play with Andrew and Edward, he did spy Stephen Barry. He sort of knew who he was. I had been in royal service since September 1966. I'd come to the conclusion that I wanted a change. I thought I would like to become a valet because it seemed to me the valets have very pleasant lives, dashing off here, there and everywhere with their masters. Now, it became a rumour that the prince was going to get his own man when he left university, and so Stephen Barry was pretty keen. It was a particularly sought-after job. Most royal staff would give their eye teeth to work for him. Everyone at the palace loved the prince and had done so since he was a little child. No one had a bad word to say for him, a unique occurrence in this kind of enclosed world in which we worked. Actually, it is rare, isn't it? No one had a bad word to say, which says a lot about the man, I would think. That brief conversation with Prince Charles, where he said, "Oh, you want to have a go being my valet, do you?" was the nearest I had to a formal interview for the job. I wasn't a stranger to him, and then he goes on to say about the nursery footman thing, where I jumped ahead of myself and told you that, didn't I? So he did know who Stephen Barry was. Every royal male has 2 valets, a senior and a junior one, so I wasn't left to swim alone in the deep water. I had James MacDonald to guide me. Thank goodness, because you would panic, wouldn't you? I mean, how would you know what to do? You wouldn't know what to do, would you? My room at Windsor was not far from the Prince, and he said that he already had really pleasant rooms at Buckingham Palace, so he didn't want to move out of those because he had 2 rooms, his own bathroom overlooking the garden at the back of Buckingham Palace, which was just such a score. He even had that as a footman. And so there was no way he was giving up those really fabulous rooms. I don't blame him, do you? Most evenings are off duty when in residence at Buckingham Palace. One can go out and have friends in, just like living anywhere. When the royal family is staying at Windsor, Balmoral and Sandringham, their staff are on full-time duty. So then it's more sensible to live fairly close to your principal royal. So at Windsor, he was close to him, but at Buckingham Palace, he held on to his rooms. I didn't start working with the Prince straight away as he went off to Canada with the Queen for 2 weeks. I bet that was a relief, give him a chance to sort of look around and see where everything was and how to do everything. Before he'd gone, the Prince had said to me, when we go up to Balmoral, would you like to come shooting as my loader? And he said, yes, sir. And he said, right, I'll tell the office to make sure you go on a course at Purdy's the gun makers. So you know what you're doing. We don't want you killing anyone. So he said it was just a very, very basic course where you taught how lethal a shotgun could be and how to load it and hold it safely and all that sort of thing. In that fortnight, I learned my way around his room and his possessions, and when he came back from Canada, 2 more weeks went by while I became more and more used to working for him until suddenly he called and said, we're going down to Cowes tonight. I was a bit surprised. I thought James would have gone with him, but I was very pleased. So they were going to join the Royal Yacht Britannia down at Cowes. Now, of course, Prince Philip was always went down to Cowes. So they were going to meet up down there. And Prince Charles decided to drive himself down in his new Aston Martin. Now, we know of that car, don't we? Because that was the one that Harry and Meghan hopped in, and I think William and Catherine also hopped in after their weddings. It was his pride and joy, while one of his policemen, Paul Officer, took the passenger seat. Gosh, he thought to himself, this is Stephen Barry thinking to himself, the Prince of Wales is driving me. That would be like a pinch me moment, wouldn't it? It took a while for it to sink in. He always plays music when he's driving, and that night we sailed down the M3 to Cowes listening to Handel's Messiah. He turned briefly to me. Do you mind this sort of music? Not in the least, I said, hardly in a position to tap him on the shoulder after 5 minutes to say, well, actually, sir, I don't like that. Can we have the Beatles? So he had packed his clothes for Cowes. First time he packed for him, but it was under James's supervision. I felt more at home when we arrived at the Britannia late that night because I already knew everybody on board, as I'd been on the yacht for 9 weeks when I went to Australia with the Queen as a footman in April that year. My accommodation had changed though. Instead of being in a cabin below decks with the footman and other staff, I was suddenly up on the same deck as the Prince. Very comfortable it was too. So his salary went up as well. Now, this is where I can't work it out. See if you can let me know down below. He says that I was kept on my footman's salary for 3 months while he was on trial. Then I was given the proper valet salary of £98. Now, what is that? £98 in 1970. Is it per year? Is it per month? Is it per... Oh, it's not per week. I know that. Well, what do you think it was? How frequently is that £98? And he had to have his uniform, pumps and tailcoat taken out of that wage, but he was put into suits at their expense. Cowes was a very easy introduction to becoming a manservant. He just used to go sailing all day, and the most important piece of clothing was his raincoat. He'd say he would be back around 5, so he was really careful to be ready when the Prince got back on board, and so he'd be waiting at about 4. But he says a very interesting thing. He says, gradually I got to know his timings. I learned how to be there just before I was required, so that in between times I could get on with my own life. Cowes only lasts 3 or 4 days for the royals, and the yacht sails off on its usual routine up to Southampton. That's where the Queen gets on board with her younger children, which is Andrew and Edward. Prince Philip was on board already. He was the Commodore at Cowes. And then they would set off for their Scottish holiday, stopping daily on the way, cruising the Western Isles. Oh, it sounds blissful, doesn't it? It was my first experience of the endless royal picnics they so enjoy, however inclement the weather. Picnics to a royal are like banquets to the rest of us. We would normally leave the ship at Aberdeen and join a fleet of cars to Balmoral. Remember what he said in Royal Secrets, where he said that all the staff would sort of swap their shifts and everything, so there was constantly cars having to go from Balmoral to the station, and the Queen put her foot down because she thought it was such a waste of resources and petrol and time. So then they made it firm that if you were on schedule at Balmoral that you had to keep your shift, and that they all went on a bus to and from the station at the end of their, week-long shift or whatever it was. My lessons at Purdy's paid off. I went out with the guns, acting as the prince's loader. For this, he bought me a shooting suit with tweed +4s and a jacket in the Balmoral tartan. And there I was, out on the grouse moors with royals, dogs, beaters, gillies, Scottish gamekeepers, all around and birds falling out of the sky. I had to keep up with him on a shoot. My God, I was stiff after the first few days. Muscles I didn't know I owned were hurting. He always seemed to land at the top of a hill while I was struggling behind. "Can you keep up?" he asked after the first couple of days, half mocking, half concerned. The Gillies, fortunately, were really, really kind to Stephen Barry, and they gave him shortcuts to sort of make it up the hills because there was easier ways. The then Prince Charles used to just power up this steep cliff, to get up to the top of the hill. But the Gillies would say, "Go around that way. There's a little, meandering path. It's a lot easier and quicker." So that's what he'd do. He got to learn all the shortcuts. He says they were much quicker and a lot less painful. What was a pleasure on the Balmoral holiday was seeing my employers totally relaxed. And this is lovely. If you miss our late Queen, this is lovely. Listen to this description. The Queen, whom one always imagines in tiaras and ball gowns, would be wearing an old friend Burberry mackintosh, a headscarf, muddy rubber boots, and be wrapped up against the rarely kind Scottish weather. I never stayed at Balmoral for the entire holiday. I would try to take my own while the Prince was holidaying himself, so that the important work routines would not be disturbed. I had 5 weeks off a year. That's quite a lot for those days, 5 weeks off a year with pay. That's pretty good. And often the Prince would just say randomly to him, "I won't be wanting you, Stephen. Why don't you go off somewhere yourself?" And so I would take myself off to France for a few days. Well, half your luck. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Being a valet was definitely better than being a footman. And that's the end of chapter 2. I will do another 2 chapters because they're quite short. Next episode, I will try to do another one later this week. I've got quite a few sort of appointments with my bloody broken ankle, unfortunately, so that's taking up time. But if I do have a chance, I will do another one and maybe put it up for you later this week so you don't have to pine too long for your next episode. Thank you so much for joining me for Royal Service, my 12 years as valet to Prince Charles. I'm enjoying it already. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you again really soon. Bye.